Thank you so much. Okay, this is going to be interesting. So for the next 30 minutes or so, or until they tell me to stop, I will make some observations based on my own work, but also my experiences of other people's work, particularly in academia, but also in the arts. You'll see maybe mostly examples that are closely related to film, but I think some of the things that I have to say move beyond just those kinds of XR experiences. I'm hoping that if you're already working in the field, this might be like a recalibration, a reminder, maybe a provocation. We'll see. This is me trying out Apple Vision Pro at South by in March this year. What I'm watching is a music performance, which is visible on the laptop there next to me. And the artist is standing right in front of me in a photorealistic desert landscape. What I remember is the light. It's amazingly light. Now, not the headset. That was heavy, clunky, front heavy, really uncomfortable. And they'll get to that, I think. You can see that on my face. It's like, cumbersome. There's no way that we forget that we have a device sitting on our face like that. But there is a lot of excitement and amazement as these technologies, who already have decades of development behind them, are finally coming to consumer level, even maybe very expensive ones like the Apple device. And they're sophisticated, and they're added to a wide array of technologies that can add, that place themselves in between us, our perceiving, thinking, feeling, and sensing bodies, and that which we call reality. So my propositions here sit somewhere in between the technological affordances of these technologies, the design and sort of accumulated knowledge in many fields, from art, games, and beyond, the longer history of related media forms that are now being remediated into XR technologies. And this is just one configuration. Remediation is, of course, J. David Bolter's terminology for when we borrow technologies and representations and move them into newer forms and what happens there. And a lot of the striving in XR has been for transparency and immersion. And I'm going to talk a little bit against that, I think. But first off, maybe we should start there. Don't believe the hype. This is my generation. I like this. This is very good. There's a sense that XR technologies, whether coming in the shape of VR headsets or augmented reality glasses or the Vision Pro, that they hold a particular promise of being able to transport us to different worlds if they can just get good enough, right? So we're going to look at the vision of big tech. We're going to see these two talk a little bit. They are indeed spearheading the development of the hardware at the moment, but they might not be the right people to actually think about what we should do with technologies such as Apple Vision Pro, Meta Quests, and AR glasses, which we've seen Mark Zuckerberg, I think, is surfing with his Ray-Bans. We're going to hear a little bit Mark Zuckerberg in an interview with Lex Friedman inside a metaverse space. And this is thanks to experimental, highly sophisticated scannings that they've done of their heads and expressions. Let's listen to them for a couple of minutes. That's about what we can take, I think.
I think it's really magical. I mean, this gets to kind of the core of what the vision around virtual and augmented reality is, of like delivering a sense of presence as if you're there together, no matter where you actually are in the world. And I mean, this experience, I think, is a good embodiment of that, where it's like, I mean, we're in two completely different states halfway across the country, and it just like, looks like you're just sitting right in front of me. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, I mean, I can't, I'm almost getting
Emotional is about what he's to say. They're two floating heads and partial torsos, but they are getting really excited about this dark space. And it is reality, of course, too. It's a different kind of reality. Right? Their view of the end goal of XR is getting better at this and making sure that we can scan the whole world, which is what Mark Zuckerberg says a little bit later on. He's very excited about all of us scanning our bodies into preferably his metaverse and not someone else's. So I want to bring up a term which I understand is going to come later on too, which is great, reality plus. David Chalmers, a lot of the terminology around XR, the word reality is of course there, it appears. And there's an astonishment over the mediation, obviously, but there's also a sense of magic, right? That this could be reality for us, this mediation. A goal for a lot of the research into visual and haptic aspects of these technologies might be to become closer to how we feel and sense in the physical world. But I have argued, together with colleagues that I've worked with, that it's an amazement and astonishment about the mediation, not about being fooled into a different reality. So Chalmers talks about virtual reality from a philosophical standpoint, where he argues that, in fact, it is just reality, genuine reality, all of it. It's his name for the universe of virtual and non-virtual worlds. And I think that's an interesting ontological problem to ponder. The way that we've come about looking at this is thinking about mediation and the ways in which XR technologies link to other representations that do similar things. We proposed reality media instead, to kind of putting mediation and the history of media in relation to this latest wave of technologies. So we point out that a lot of the representational strategies and practices in VR actually owe a lot to earlier technologies, things like panoramas that have been around since the 18th century, and a lot of other technologies like art, painting, and film that seek to provide a sensory experience that, take us to a different place where we cannot go maybe, or see something that we usually would not be able to see. And we argue that the photorealistic paradigm is really strong in the rhetoric of these technologies. And that relates them to other older media as well. And the realization is also that this matters because the technologies encroach upon us on our senses to a deeper and possibly more intimate manner than earlier ones, even though they're similar. I'm not going to go into ethics. I don't have the time to talk about data capture and digital twins, but there are some real consequences of building the kinds of digital avatars of ourselves and turn not only our web activities to data, but also our very own bodies, everything around us, animals, built environments, nature, and so on, into digital data that can be used. And I have a lot of colleagues in my department of computer science that do exactly that are working in the Internet of Things and similar fields. So this is our starting point, right? XR technologies do indeed, I think, upload our bodies is a great term. So my propositions are some food for thought. I hope to get a little bit of pushback maybe from some of you. Thinking theoretically about XR, I've used them also as methodologies for my own work, but also just thinking about what we can do and how we should think about designing for these kinds of platforms. So maybe some provocations, we'll see. The first one is, don't talk about immersion. So at the heart of these technologies is this intense embodied experience, which researchers and creators alike have discussed as immersion, a sense of presence, that this is what we're striving for. It's technically complex and difficult to attain. It's still something that computer scientists are working with. But the word immersion has carried beyond its technical meanings. And we talk a lot about, we should be feeling immersed, right? I think we should talk about embodiment instead. And a lot of people do in the field. Researchers are coming to this, particularly the ones who are engaging with phenomenology, thinking about situated, personal, contingent embodiment that relies on so many various ways of being, of bodies, and sensorial states. There's a sort of gliding of how the concept of immersion has been used between the ways that computer scientists and developers have needed to understand how you relate these technologies to the ways in which we function as living bodies. But it's also been like a catch-all phrase by scholars to say that XR technology by default will create an immersive experience. And it's almost meant to be seen as emotionally engaging. That's what we sort of feel that this term should mean for us. You need to program interactions and virtual spaces that respond to and behave in ways that correspond to how our bodies are perceiving them, for sure. But the physiological sensory responses should be seen as linked to, but not the same as the conscious and articulated experience that someone might have in them. I see this so often when I talk to people who've created immersive experiences. We wanted to create an empathetic and immersive experience. And I understand why that is there, because the technologies are new and you need to find a way to kind of, help the user, the audience along to what they're about to experience. I may feel enveloped in the technology with my senses and everything. I think most of us in the room know what it feels like to have a VR headset on us. That doesn't mean I feel immersed or present. I can have a lot of other feelings and emotions as well, right? So rather than foreground that this will be an immersive experience, you should trust that it'll be an embodied experience and a reaction and engagement with the work. There's been a lot of talk about immersion and empathy. I'm going to link to some papers that I'm referring to sort of implicitly in my talk at the end of this. You can take a look. But we will start by watching a clip from On the Morning You Wake, which is a 38-minute documentary, which is written by Jamaica Hio Lime Leikalani Osorio, Mike Brett, and Steve Jameson. It's about a morning in Hawaii. An ordinary morning as Hawaiian citizens went about their daily business. Everyone in the state received a text message. This is true in 2018, January 13, from the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency. Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. And we're going to take a look at this a little bit.
On the morning you wake to the end of the world, take your body back to the kai. To the place our kupuna taught us life began. First pole, then coral, then slime, then a whole universe fitting into a space smaller than a grain of sand. Then air rising through the ocean, pulling the tides that make mountains, valleys, and the rivers that cut through them. Remember our Aina, for all the ways she had fed us. In the quiet darkness before the blast, dive yourself back into the depth of creation, recalling all the times your world has ended before. In Hawaii, we have this saying that says, "Ikawa mamua, ikawa mahope," which means the time in front of you and the time behind you. But kawa mamua, the time in front of you, also means the past. And the time behind you, kawa mahope, means the time that comes after or the future. And so one of the things that's kind of written into our understanding of time and space is that we always back into the future facing the past.
So I think this is a good example of a work that, rather than relying solely on photorealistic representation and documentary, they seek to convey it's got a fundamentally emotional, embodied experience, and they use many different visuals, kinetic, haptic, and sonic mediations. And I'll play a little bit more so you can get a sense of what that looks like.
Modern nuclear weapons have a destructive force tens to hundreds of times more powerful than those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If one were detonated over a metropolis like New York, Tokyo, Paris, or London, over 15 square miles would be flattened by the initial blast. Almost 50 square miles would be consumed by fire. About 1 million people would die instantly. The scientists who designed nuclear weapons said it best, that in all-out nuclear war, the living would envy the dead.
So I think it's always difficult to show this because the person is not moving their head a lot, but this is quite different when you're seeing it in VR headsets. So if we are to be enveloped in the aesthetic, visual, sonic, storytelling, music playing, history-invoking space that you've made, if you are creators, then make it worth it. Make it interesting. Now, the second point is, if we're talking about immersion, which we are, whose body, whose mind, whose experience? So there is ample and understandable criticism in the field, scholarly as well as beyond, over the overly simplistic argument that being immersed into a virtual or augmented space will automatically be more empathetic, that we will feel more for the people that we are seeing. And I'm sure that all of you know this if you know VR. So this is, I'm using it because I want to reference Lisa Nakamura. Now, this is an early 360-degree documentary, Clouds of Isidra. It portrays the life of Syrian refugees in a camp. It purports to allow the viewer to feel empathy because you're put there, right there in the camp with them. Now, Asian American scholar Lisa Nakamura leverages really harsh criticism against this kind of racialized and sensationalized use of XR technologies, which are quite common now, actually, to represent and document human rights violations and displaced people's lives in refugee camps. She also talks about racialized violence in the US in her article, as well as exploitative representations of transgender youth, the homeless, and domestic violence. So while these are kind of laudable causes to make documentaries about, Nakamura speaks of them as pleasures of toxic embodiment offered by witnessing racial suffering, and argues that VR about victimized people that are used in this way has much in common with earlier forms such as literature, photography, and film, all of which use representations of suffering to produce feelings of immersion, identification, and empathy for those whose bodies are not ours. So she says, rather than trying to automate compassion for those who suffer as a result of racialized violence, indifference, and hyper-automation, we need forms of critique that obviously gives voice to the people that are being represented, but also show us how emotions like empathy and compassion have alibied untenable material conditions of labor for racialized and gendered people. And this goes to the arguments about VR as an empathy machine, right? Thinking about bodies doesn't only have to be about representation, it is also physiological. We still haven't worked around this simple problem. There is still significant evidence and a lot of studies, particularly in computer science, where they try to solve it, right, in various ways, that some, if not many, people will feel nauseous or experience what's called cyber sickness or the like in XR spaces, particularly female bodies. And there's a lot of continued research into this, and this is a reminder for designers and those who work in XR experience to not only test for your own bodily experience, but also that of others, because what you feel may not be what others feel, and almost certainly it's not what someone else is feeling. The third one is think critically about visuals. Think more about sound. XR technologies are grounded in visual computing. It's where it started, it's natural. This is what we see first. Vision is still quite prominent, but there are important and much needed developments regarding haptics, movement, and sound. And there's a lot of it coming both in terms of research and development in different fields, the arts, obviously, but sound is an underdeveloped field. And in fact, they argue that it's easier to get a connection with someone through an XR experience with sound than it is with visuals. And yet, visuals seem still to come second. We're going to see a snippet of an older work called Notes on Blindness. This is something that, it's always hard. You want to have newer examples, but I still think this is quite good because of the background. So you're accessing John Hall's world of blindness, and it's exploratory, it's user-led, and it's drawing upon this man who loses his sight and recorded his experiences. The narration is of the original audio diaries. But the experience uses binaural sound, which is tethered to real-time 3D visualization. And there are many more works like this. and in particular experimentation with binaural sound and spatial sounds in 3D spaces would allow us to break a little bit of this kind of ocular-centric discourse that still exists in this field, not only scholarly. So we'll see a little snippet for those of you who may not know this work.
This is cassette 1, track 1, Notes on Blindness.
Sitting in the park with the children, I hear the footsteps of people walking past me, rustling of the newspaper, murmur of conversation. The myriad voices and sounds create a panorama of music and information. Where there is no activity, there's no sound, and then that part of the world dies. The earliest experience of panic took place in the middle of December. I left the house, but had only gone about 100 yards when I was aware of a growing feeling of doubt and uncertainty, as if I was banging my head, my whole body against the wall of blindness.
So I was just talking to someone before the talk saying I would like to exchange this for another work that's come out more recently, but I haven't looked at it myself, where it's dealing with visuals and sounds, but what it feels like to be inside a brain that has ADHD. And so these kinds of different sensory states that people have are something that you can obviously use XR to represent and work with, but my point there is try to use sound more than visuals. Now, my fourth point is make it a shared experience. Now, XR experiences can be solitary, one-on-one with the mediation, and sometimes isolation in a way that actually can feel uncomfortable. So there are, of course, other spaces using XR, particularly in games, that thrive on social spaces, interaction, play, and shared experience. But there are a number of other areas where people are trying to figure out what XR can do. And this is one of them. How many of you were able to partake in Fatboy Slim? Yes, we were all scrambling to get tickets to that one when it came out. So 45 minutes of Eat, Sleep, VR, Repeat. I'm going to play a little bit anyway. Maybe you've seen it already. So an immersive metaverse concert in collaboration with Fatboy Slim's Norman Cook. And it was showed as a limited screening on March 30th, 2023. And it really was incredible. It was groundbreaking in many ways. It had a lot of funding, obviously, behind it. There were a lot of someone called it novel interactions. If by novel you mean riding around on a cockroach, which you could do. It was really trippy and kind of psychedelic. It played a lot with scale, which was interesting. And here's some clips to show you. The first one is from their own website, I believe. Because last night I saw a great example of thinking about shared experiences. Paula Stranden, who's in the room, her work, Rhetorical Bodies, which is part of the exhibition that Boris was just mentioning, I think is an excellent example of how, as an artist or creator, you're exploring spatial, interactional, and performative aspects of a work that can invite the audience, or in this case, there was a collaborator, a dancer, to share a virtual reality space and also provide a different kind of experience for an audience who are not in the space. So we're going to watch a little bit of that. So my take on this, it's a shared experience, but it also seems to foreground a phenomenologically rich experience of what we might call reality X. Here's a lot of things going on, right? Are existing both in the physical world and in the digital one, but where our bodies in VR here become pure movement. Our bodies are changing into amorphous blobs, and they're moving away from this kind of photorealistic dominance, which I think also centers you, or maybe makes it even more uncomfortable. I don't know. I've yet to try it. To sort of sense what your body is sensing when you become this blob, but you recognize the movement of your legs and so on anyway. But this links me to the fifth one. Take trust seriously. So designing for and experiencing XR takes trust. If I'm allowed to technological mediations close to my body, and indeed maybe replace my sensory perception of the world completely, and normally I'm grounded physically, emotionally, perceptually in the world, there's trust involved, quite simply. And there's trust in part of the audience member and care on part of the creator. So working with someone's perception of reality, messing about with it, as these mediations do, but also other forms of art, I think you should think of the mediations of care and trust as a dynamic relationship in which the maker has particular responsibility. Now, that doesn't mean that we cannot be provocative or challenged, scared, emotionally manipulated, or disturbed by what we experience, because art should have that possibility as well. But because of the embodied intensity with which we often experience XR, because we're sometimes being, deprived of other sensory input, this can involve risks. So I'm going to show a last example. It's Danish artist collective Macropole had an installation in 2017 called Anthropia. I have just a small clip. It basically is a VR setting in which you walk around in a huge space. You cannot see anything but the VR representation, and you're playing mini golf. And as soon as you get the ball in a hole, you get to see a 360-degree film. You don't know what will come next. You don't know how long it's coming soon, how long the experience will last, or where it may lead them next. So now we're going to see a super small snippet. And I've written about this as an embodied experience which pushes at the limits of care. I've taken away the sound because this comes from the trailer and had a kind of music, but this is the work that I want you to pay attention to. Now we only get this small snippet. It's much longer and it has sounds. Now we are being asked physically to lie down with a backpack and a headset, which feels vulnerable and uncomfortable with the VR headset. And we hear someone breathing. It's dark. You open your eyes and you can see a man in plastic protective coveralls leaning over you. You cannot see very much, even if you turn around. So you are a person who's lying down, closing and opening their eyes, and you can hear their breathing. And pretty soon, this point of view makes you feel as if you're the person on the floor. And the breathing is quickening. This is someone who's afraid. And it's starting to affect your own pace of breathing. It's almost natural to get into the space of, because you see the men, they're hovering over you, they have blood on their coveralls, and you realize, oh, this is just a straightforward genre piece of a murder scene, just like any film and TV series that you've seen plenty of. But my point is, the narrow and closed field of view, the first-person viewpoint, the sound of the audio, and the fact that I am physically lying down with a lot of apparatus on top of me means that you start to feel panicked. And this is where I felt this is sort of moving very close to the sense of where I feel I'm being taken care of in this XR experience. Some people thought it was thrilling. I thought it was difficult, right? So don't worry about the acronyms and the definitions. They all keep changing all the time anyway. Do worry about affordances, experiences, and care. Learn from other representational art forms, whether for creation or for scholarship, in order to fight that overwhelming sense of newness. And think thoroughly about the experiences that you see or create, and approach these emotionally and intimately intense technologies with a sense of care. And that's where I'm going to stop. And I have lots of references, so I've put up a Google Doc for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for your very inspiring talk. Let's take some QR codes.
Tell me if it's working. I've tried it out so
I will also try.
No access? I'm going to immediately go and fix that. I thought I opened it to the world.
Yeah, you need permission. Request access. Any other questions from the room?
Oh, I'm supposed to not sit down. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Any thoughts, questions, remarks? Yes, I will.
Well, thank you for the talk. That was really very thought-provoking. I was curious about the examples that you gave, where you suggest that it's worth it and that it provides the emotional experience. And the examples that you were showing, that's a blind person and a dead person. So does the emotional experience necessarily mean, well, and before you were saying that showing suffering bodies is a wrong thing. Well, especially when they're racially different from you, and when they're females. Well, you didn't talk about transgender, but we can talk about that as well. Okay, so I saw a little contradiction in what you were saying. So showing suffering this way is wrong, but showing suffering that way is like blind person was a good example, right? So what is the proper emotional experience? My question is, how would you formulate the emotional experience to get up to
So now Micropole is going to be actually the Ali Abbasi who's done that particular piece. It's not a question of right and wrong in that regard, because it's fictional. We're allowed to do a lot in fiction. I think one of the key differences is documentary. So the earlier ones, they purport to be documentaries, and they have real people in them. Real as in, these are people who live, and they're getting cameras in their living space, and basically taking away their voice, because as we know in Clouds of Sidra, it's not the girl's voice even. There's a voiceover, and there's so many things going on there. In the murdered scene, I wouldn't create an XR piece like that. I think it violates emotional sort of physical integrity, but not because you're not allowed to do it, but because they have this sense, like I've interviewed some creators who say, I want to scare the audience, I want to make them uncomfortable, so I'm not going to warn them at all. And I think I'm woefully against trigger warnings and all of that, please. I don't want them, but give me a choice. And it's a question of choice, I think, there, to get a sense of, okay, this is going to maybe have some scenes that you might feel are uncomfortable. So a little bit of a description. But because they want to keep the mystery of the experience and the wow factor, they choose not to, right? So I'm not arguing that one is okay and one is not, but they're trying to do different things. And in this sort of larger scheme of things, I think the documentaries are quote unquote worse for the reasons that I just said, right? They are violating and sort of changing the conversations around real suffering in ways that are not helpful. Yeah. Right, because Chris Milk argued that people will give money and help if they only can see these documentaries in 360-degree form, and that is of course not true. Yes.
Okay, so I was wondering about your personal experience, because you showed 2 works in which you went to a VR concert. There has been some scientific research about listening to live music and to going to concerts, and how that embodies you and that it helps our brain and it gives positive emotions. How does that relate to like the VR experiences you've seen? So the individual concert which you saw, did that give you the same embodiment of going to a live concert, and also the like the VR big experience with all those other people? Did you also feel their presence, or did you not?
So in the Fatboy Slim example, there were a number of things that were happening. It was a long experience, and on occasion I had to sit down and take off my headset a little bit because I get easily dizzy in these spaces and nauseous. But I would say that dancing helped, and photorealistic, the fact that they're not trying to do it photorealistically also helped. You didn't have to kind of get a point of view always, but still the normal kind of difficulties of a VR space that I usually have also appeared there. Because you're in a concert and you don't always have to look around you, I also closed my eyes and just listened to the music, right? I didn't care about what was going on around me. As in engaging with other people, people were talking to each other, some people were recognizing each other and having a little conversation. Oh, are you here? You know? And that's interesting. I would not say that this is like the experience I have when I go to another concert, but it is a form of concert, right? Just like any other. And I've been to many different concerts, and a jazz concert is not the same as when I've been to, what are the concerts I've been to lately? Like Depeche Mode, Queens of the Stone Age, and a few others. And they're very different, right? Very different experiences, very different audiences, but also very different social cues about what's correct and not correct to do. Dancing around like crazy in a jazz concert, maybe not what they like, right? So what I'm saying, basically, making fun of it, is basically these are all socio-culturally contingent and situated experiences, right?
No Lindy hopping allowed. A last question, and while we do our last question, maybe we can have also a transition in tech.
All right. I want to go back to the empathy machine. And then we have Bertolt Brecht. I mean, I think this is something that we cannot resolve, the empathy fatigue. I think one of the things that the United Nations, I worked with them on several 360 video projects, and I went to Nigeria and whatnot. And I think one of their ideas was because people are, and also politicians that give money to the United Nations, are sort of bored of watching documentaries about people in camps. But you are bored too. Are you giving money to the United Nations monthly? No. So it's a real thing. I mean, not everybody wants to get dropped in a camp to have that experience. Did it change me? Yes. Do I pay monthly to the United Nations? Yes, I do. I don't want to boast about it. It's a small amount. But, going there physically, sure, and talking with people and having to shelter for bombs, yes, it will change you. But back to the VR, I think there was a genuine hope that it did change. They did get more money by showing en masse to the stakeholders to put them in a VR headset. And there's this famous picture, I think, with Chris Milk, with all these delegates in the VR headsets, and they did get more funding, but for a short time, like with any video, and then after 2 weeks, you could measure a bit more empathy for about 2 weeks, and then that sort of fades away. There's been studies that have been done on that. So in a way, with your embodiment, we're always limited by our own bodies and our own emotional senses and what we can do, and it's also protection of ourselves. We cannot always sympathize up until the end with the whole world. It's impossible. So, but I just wanted to state that there was this genuine, hope that it would change that. So that was just a thing I wanted to say. I didn't agree with Chris Milk's empathy machine because I never believed in that, and I also understand the limits of it. And the discussions on documentary are also endless of who needs to talk and who needs to be behind the camera and so on. We let local people talk on our pieces, but there's always gonna be critique and so on. So there's no ideal solution to any of this, really. I mean, I like the Hawaii one too. You can download it for free, by the way, if you want to see it. So just wanted to say this as a side note.
Well, a comment quickly before we get Joyce the floor. I think that the sort of the premise is wrong. Maybe the wrong people were making those kinds of films. Maybe they were coming into a field from a different point of view, where, as you say, there's been rich work. I've worked a lot more with visual anthropologists and others who have a very different point of view, and they're also using 360-degree cameras, but in a very different way than Chris Milk is. And so it's not the question necessarily exactly of empathy machine or not, because that is, of course, coming from film, but what the technologically deterministic arguments were about and how that kind of latches on and still lingers when it comes to certain technologies, because they're new and because we are not yet so used to them. And I think that is what we're sort of arguing against. And then there is a real point, I think, regardless of medium, that in order to solve some of these issues, the people that live through them need to be represented and present, and not just someone who's sort of speaking for them. Yeah. Thank you.